I'd like to welcome everyone to our Wednesday evening Bible study. A few announcements, and then we'll have our invitation, and then invitation song and prayer, and then we'll go to our respective classes. Our song leader tonight will be Jesse. The invitation song will be number 310. Our prayer before we go to classes will be led by Brother Max. A few announcements. I'm going to go over the ones from Sunday or in the bulletin, but I'll go over a few. Ron Adams, please keep him in your prayers, with him the loss of his wife Martha, and also his physical issues. And if you can, go by and visit Ron sometime. It would mean a lot to him. Roland comes back from Nigeria tomorrow. We're just told he's actually in the air en route somewhere over Europe, I think, right now. But it'll be great to see Roland back with us. Johnny Hiley mentioned Sunday that he needs some names on a Lord's Supper preparation sheet back there to prepare to get things ready for the Lord's Supper. I just took a glance back there, and there's a lot of empty blanks. So please make the blanks go away. Patsy Boyd needs our prayers. She's hurting in her shoulder, she's hurting in her hip, and she's scheduled for MRIs to get a better idea of what's wrong and whether or not she needs surgery or not. February 12. And Carl Dixon just mentioned that his mom lives in Indiana. Her name's Vera, that he believes that she had a mild heart attack, and they're going to be doing testing on her, so keep his mom in your prayers. Are there any announcements that I did not make or did not know about that someone wants to speak up? In the 1970s, disaster movies were very popular. You had Airport, you had the Poseidon Adventure, big budget, and that was a big popular movie genre in the 1970s. One of those movies was called The Towering Inferno, starring Paul Newman and Steve McQueen. Every woman in America liked one or both of those guys. I can promise you. The Towering Inferno, that movie is what it says it is. It's a towering inferno. A skyscraper catches fire, and you have people screaming, terror, destruction, some rescues. That movie is set in San Francisco, and the building in the movie is supposed to be 138 stories tall, which at the time that would have been the tallest building in the world, but that's a pretend movie. In real life, one of the buildings that they did use in San Francisco was 52 stories, called the Bank of America building. But in movies, it can be ever how tall they want it to be. Jump forward to the 1990s. I'm now working in San Francisco. And I was in a 23-story building, and I had an office with a window, and you could see out through part of the San Francisco, including a view of some of the tall buildings in San Francisco. And one of the buildings I could see out the window was the building they used in the Towering Inferno, the Bank of America building. We lived there for 16 years in the Bay Area, and it's very famous for its fog. Many afternoons, the fog will roll in like clockwork and envelop the city. And the fog will hide the top of the tall buildings, and you can always see the bottom of the buildings because the top of the buildings are in the fog. One day I was taking a daydreaming break at work, looking out the window, watching the fog and daydreaming, and watching the fog go around. And beside our building was a lower building that you could see the roof of that building. And I kept noticing this bird flying back and forth across this roof. I'm like, what is that bird doing? It just kept back and forth. And then I looked on the roof of the building, and I saw a dead bird on the roof. And that bird was flying back and forth like it was checking or concerned about that dead bird. I'm not sure what kind of species it was. It was some kind of bird, I guess, that hangs around the ocean or the Bay Area. And after a few minutes, the bird eventually flew away. And I thought, wonder what happened to that dead bird. And I thought, God knew what happened to that dead bird. God knew when that bird fell from the sky and why that bird died. Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, verses 27 through 31. Matthew 10, 27 through 31. Whatever I tell you in the dark, speak in the light, and what you hear in the ear, preach in the housetops. And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin? And not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will. But the very hairs of your head are numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are more value than many sparrows. Jesus didn't use the word sparrow there as a coincidence or random. He used that bird because that was a very common bird in the New Testament times, and that's still a very common bird throughout the world. And of course, those are throughout North America and Tennessee. But there's nothing special about a sparrow from a bird watching point of view. It's not colorful, it's not rare. People would not notice a sparrow. It would not be important to people. That's why Jesus used that as an example. A few years ago, Hay and I were out driving around one early morning just after sunrise, kind of further past Sleeper's Fork. And I'm always looking for hawks or weird birds. It's quiet. We didn't see a car for like miles and miles and miles. And all of a sudden I said, Hayden, that's a bald eagle. And there in one of the fields there was a bald eagle out there by itself. Well, no one was coming, so we stopped, we took pictures, we called Mom, we called my sister, and we were all excited about the bald eagle. If you came up to someone that's so excited and said, I saw a sparrow today, I saw a sparrow today, they think, you're weird. But God notices and cares about all his creation. Verse 31, he says, are you more value than many sparrows? We're made in God's image. We're his special creation, and we have something precious inside of us called a soul. Jesus said, what would profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? You've read that verse and seen that verse many times, but you really stop and think of that? One soul, one, is worth more than the entire world. God had his son to leave heaven, to come down to this world, to live as a man, to die on the cross, to be buried and be resurrected, all because he loves us, that we might have forgiveness of our sins, that we can be in a holy relationship with God. And that sacrifice was the only way that was going to happen. That was the only way we could be saved, by the shed blood of the Lamb of God. In the book of John, chapter 6. Book of John, chapter 6, verse 65 through 69. And he said, therefore I have said to you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted to him by my Father. For that time many of the disciples went back and walked with him no more. And Jesus said to the 12, do you also want to go away? But Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And we have come to believe and know that you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's my favorite verse in the entire Bible, is verse 68. Not spoken by God, not spoken by Jesus, not spoken by Paul, but Peter said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Do you believe, like Peter, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God? Are you ready to make that same confession? Are you ready to be baptized for the remission of your sins? Don't lay your head on your pillow tonight if you're not a child of God. We're not promised tomorrow, and it's too important. You have a soul that will live forever. Or maybe you are a child of God, but somewhere you got off track. And maybe you need the support and the prayers of people here that worship with you and love you. In either case, if we can help you tonight in any way, come while we sing our invitation song, number 310.
Our omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent God, we're so thankful to be under your watchful eye, and that we ask you to continue to watch over those that are suffering illnesses or issues, health issues. We ask that you watch over them and see to their needs and provide whatever they need for full recoveries. Father, we are so thankful for this time that we have to come together to refresh our minds and become more knowledgeable in the things that you would have us to know. Father, we ask that you watch over those that are traveling, Roland and Garland, those that are away from home. Keep them safe during their travels and bring them home to their families. Father, it's our hope that after this night, after we participate in the studies and prepared by the class teachers, that each one of us is lifted up, better prepared to serve, and Father, nearer to you. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Good evening, everyone. I am filling in for Mitch tonight. He's preaching, teaching somewhere on the north side of Nashville. I don't remember. I'm sorry. Chapel Heights. He's preaching somewhere else tonight. I think the real reason is trying to teach another class on Esther after everything we talked about Sunday. It's like there's not a whole lot that we haven't already talked about. So some of this is going to sound like a review. If so, forgive me. But the approach I wanted to take tonight is to look at Esther herself. I mean, we've been talking about the book and the story, and we've talked about not just Esther, but King Ahasuerus, Mordecai, Haman, and some of the other characters. In keeping with our theme for our Wednesday night study, I want to try to look at Esther herself and see what there is in Esther's story that we can find some application for ourselves today. So without belaboring what we've already talked about, just a quick refresher. Esther is a young woman of Jewish descent, orphaned apparently as a child. Her cousin, Mordecai, takes her in and raises her as part of the family. The family is living in Persia, in Susa, the capital of Persia. King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, is on the throne. So that sets us about 485 to 465 BC, which means it's after the initial return of the Jews to Judea, but before Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra leads the second return, and then Nehemiah goes and oversees. This story is taking place between those. Esther is described as a beautiful young woman, described as being beautiful in face and form. So we would say she got a very attractive body and a very pretty face. You remember we talked about Vashti and her defiance to the king's command and his setting her aside, and Esther being selected by the officials. And let me ask you this, because this is not a lecture, this is a class. Do you get the feeling that Esther wanted to go to the palace? No? I don't either. I mean, I think it was the king's officials that put out a decree, had all the young women turn out and went down the line and picked out the most attractive virgins. And Esther was selected. I don't really gather from what I see here of this being Esther's choice, like she's trying to advance her social. I certainly don't see this as being Mordecai's choice, but I'll come back to that thought before we're done tonight. But Esther is selected. However it happened, she's selected. She enters the king's palace. It says that she was given over to Haggai, the chief eunuch in charge of the women, and she found favor in his sight. He put her in the best place of the harem, gave her 7 maids. She spent 12 months. It talks about verse 12 of chapter 2, the days of their beautification, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months of spice. So it's kind of like a makeover, if you will, but I don't think it's unreasonable to infer that there was some training during this 12 months too, and the palace protocols and maybe even the refinements of palace culture. And then after that 12-month period, Esther is sent to the king, and she is favored above all the other women that were presented to him and becomes the queen. Haman the Agagite is an important official. We read about him later in the book in chapter 3. We remember he got crossways with Mordecai because the king promoted him and set him above all the other officials and gave a command that the people were supposed to bow, and Mordecai did not bow. And Haman, being Haman, decided that he was not only going to get that guy, but he was going to get that guy's people too. And persuaded the king to issue the edict for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai learns about this, mourns over it. Esther hears that Mordecai is mourning, sends word, and we have the exchange in chapter 4 where Mordecai urges her to appeal to the king. And this is where Esther, I think, got training in the protocols and stuff. Esther was aware of the law that to approach the king without being summoned was what? Death. Unless the king extended his scepter and gave you his favor. Did Esther want to approach the king?
I don't think so.
No, at least not initially. And she says that very clearly in verse 11, verse 10 of chapter 4. Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. This is after Mordecai has urged her to approach the king on behalf of the Jews. And she said, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned for the last 30 days. And at least the way I read that is she's saying, I can't go before the king because I haven't been summoned. Not just I haven't been summoned this week, I haven't been summoned for 30 days. So there may have been some concern that if I approach the king now after 30 days, that's going to be even more displeasing, because if he had wanted me in his presence, he would have summoned me, and it's been a whole month and he hasn't summoned me, and now you're asking me to go put myself in front of him. So while she doesn't explicitly say, I don't want to do that, at least the way I read verse 11, there's a clear reluctance to put herself in that position. Does anybody have a different take? Yes.
Well, I don't have necessarily a different take, but, she's been obedient to authority, basically all of her life.
Okay.
When she was an orphan and then went and stayed with, was adopted, and yet then she went to the palace, and yet we don't see any rebellion from her. And so she's been submissive to authority, and even later on we see that she's submissive to the authority, and she knows authority-wise that it is not her place to go before the king without being summoned. And so she just feels like, to be submissive, that it was not her place to go forward and do this, because, the laws of the land. And so she was wanting to be obedient to those laws as well as to God.
Okay.
And so that's the way that I look at it, was that she was looking at it within what is her place in life and what is her place in the authority, and that it wasn't, she didn't have the rights to go before the king without being summoned. And so whether she was afraid, I'm sure there was some scare of it because of the death penalty that was coming about, but also she didn't want to exert herself above her position and her status.
Okay, and I agree with that, and I think that probably was part of the training during that 12-month. That was drummed. Those protocols were drummed into them. What the proper conduct. Hey, girls, y'all are up for the position of queen, and this is the proper behavior for a queen. And this clearly was not something limited to just the queen's position, because she said all the king's servants know this. So yes, I do see that as part of her reluctance too. In verse 13, Mordecai, however, and a lot of people who don't know anything about Esther or much about Esther know about this reply. When Mordecai says to her in reply, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." And with that counsel, advice, command, if you want to call it a command on Mordecai's part, Esther agrees to approach the king, requests that the people fast for her, or hold a fast on her behalf, and that she will fast, but she does resolve to go to the king. And she does carry out her plan to go to the king, and he does extend his favor, so she is not killed. And then she proposes to hold a banquet for him and Haman. And they have that banquet, and the king is actually apparently so pleased with her that he is asking what her request is. What's interesting to me, and I'll come back around to this, but I'll mention it as we kind of run through our quick summary. In verse 3 of chapter 5, after the king has extended the scepter to her, so sparing her the death penalty, he says to her, "What is troubling you, Queen Esther, and what is your request?" So I think, to your point, Esther has been a very submissive, accommodating, a very faithful queen to the king. So for her to do this, I think you see the king recognize that something is amiss. Something is troubling her if it would prompt her to come into my presence unsummoned. And I think to give King Xerxes, because the other name is hard to say, to give Xerxes credit, he seems to have, at least on some level, a genuine concern for Esther as his queen. So he asks her, "What is troubling you? What's the problem? What can I do? What do you need me to do? Up to half the kingdom, I'll do this for." So Esther has this banquet. She invites the king and Haman to another banquet the next day and says, "I'll present my request to you then." Kind of as an interlude, Haman is very full of himself now, is on his way home, sees Mordecai again. Mordecai again doesn't bow, and Haman decides, forget the edict, destroying Haman with all the Jews. I want Haman's head now, and actually has a gallows built and is intending to kill Haman the next day. And yet that very night, the king is reading the Chronicles and finds where Mordecai had exposed a plot that saved the king's life. So he resolves to honor Mordecai, and through a very ironic twist of events, Haman ends up being instructed to carry out the very honors that he suggested to the king for Mordecai, because Haman thought the honors were for him. And Haman is instructed to parade Haman is instructed to parade Mordecai through the streets in honor, which he finds very humiliating, all that. And yet he gets to go to the second banquet. So he goes to the second banquet, and at that banquet, Esther reveals her heritage and exposes Haman's plot against the Jews. And the king is enraged, as kings often were back then. And Haman, in the process of trying to plead with Esther for his life, finds himself, or the king comes in to find him in what appears to be a compromising position with the king's queen, and Haman is hung on the gallows that he had actually prepared for Mordecai. And then this past Sunday, we talked about Mordecai, Esther are given Haman's house. They're given Haman's position, and the king gives Mordecai the ring and says, "I can't overturn the edict that I've already signed, but you write another edict to do whatever you see fit." And we'll see this coming Sunday that edict basically gives the Jews the authority to band together and defend themselves against their enemies, in which they're successful. And then the Feast of Purim is inaugurated to celebrate this great victory that the Jewish people had over their enemies in Persia. And as far as I know, to this day, Israel still observes Purim as a holiday. So that kind of gives you an idea of the significance of these events in the history of the Jews, both as preserving God's people, but also in they're looking back. Even secular Jews look back and remember this story about this deliverance that this young woman was able to bring about. So with that kind of fresh in our minds again, what I'd like to do is think about Esther. And what are some of the things that you see in Esther? And this is where I really struggle in this kind of setting, because I'm much more comfortable in a classroom where I have a whiteboard where I can write what you say down, but I can't do that. So I have some, but I would like to hear some of you. What are some of the characteristics that we see in Esther?
She seemed to be an extraordinary woman. And so you think about Queen Vashti is gone, and the king can't find anybody to be queen, and has to go through, I don't know if that's just a rule that they replace the queen by having all the virgins in the country come before him. I don't know. But, you know, she found favor in his sight before this time when she was scared that she wouldn't find favor. She just was an extraordinary woman, and that's the thing I see about her.
Okay. Yeah, no, actually in chapter 2, I think it's the king's officials that come up with the idea of, I think, I don't know if it's our lesson or something else I read, but it calls it a beauty pageant that was held to find the successor to the queen, but I think it's the king's officials. I don't know if this was common or if this was just in response to, you know, the devastating spectacle that Vashti had made of herself and the king in the previous chapters. But okay, so, and what specifically was it about Esther that was so extraordinary, at least in the initial, hey, we need to send this one? What do you think it was about Esther?
She was beautiful.
She was beautiful. And in, hold on, I'll find it. In verse 7 of chapter 2, it says that she was beautiful of form and face. And apparently she was a virgin, because the plan was to gather up all the young virgins. So, you know, at that point, Esther was, and it's implied, I think it's actually said that she was a young, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. So she was young. So she was a beautiful woman. And it says beautiful her face and form, you know, so in modern parts, we'd say she had a great body and a pretty face. You know, she was very attractive. Jimmy, you had a comment.
Carl, you know, all of the months of spices and perfumes that Esther and these others went through in preparation of making an appearance before King Ahasuerus. I think Esther showed her wisdom by, because she's not recorded as far as I know of her seeking wisdom from those other maidens.
Okay.
What she did, she went to the king's eunuch to find out what pleased the king. And I think that was a large plus in her favor right there. It showed a characteristic that she did have quite a bit of wisdom on that line, I think.
Okay. And I would, if I didn't know you better, I'd accuse you of sneaking a peek at my notes. But this is where I need the whiteboard, because I could write that up and come back down to it. But yes, we'll come back to her wisdom. Don, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just thinking, she had brains to go along with her beauty.
Okay.
She was very diplomatic. When she was dealing with the king, she didn't just go straight to the point. She went around to have a banquet, a second banquet,
Okay.
to finally get to what she wanted.
Okay. Very, very good. Elliot?
It's kind of on the same theme here. What I didn't notice until just for this review, several times in chapter 2, it references Esther specifically doing as, well, either doing as someone advised or not doing as someone had not advised. You got it in verse 9 talking about not telling, or sorry, no, verse 10 when she didn't tell her kindred about what? Being in the first harem. And then down on, it says she didn't go into the king's presence unless he asked. And then she only did what the eunuch said. And then later on, in verse 20, she did not make it known to her people because Mordecai had not commanded her. I thought it's interesting how it repeats that 4 times throughout that chapter of her heeding instructions.
Yes.
I wonder why that's so repetitive.
Hold on to that thought. And because I have a question for you based on that observation there in a couple minutes. Brad?
just expanding on the idea of her being clever and intelligent. For somebody who is so young, multiple times it talks about how she grew in favor with the people around her. And it wasn't, this isn't something that's done, it is an active thing. It's not a passive thing. So she's doing things, she's saying things to grow in favor with people. And despite the fact how young she is and being out of her comfort zone, she's away from her family, she's away from her relatives, the place that she grew up, and totally unfamiliar location. So especially for a young person, that's very admirable.
I agree. Max?
Now look at Esther, she's the vessel that the Lord used to accomplish his will.
Okay.
The Lord, he gave her so much to prepare her to do what he wanted her to do. He gave her Mordecai, who trained her up, and probably in the law. The eunuchs, he provided the eunuchs that gave her training as a queen. I mean, God doesn't I don't think he just puts you out there for a mission. He prepared her, and he prepared her over years. It wasn't like she's going to be a queen and she's going to save the Jewish nation. This was a plan that unfolded over years. God took his time and prepared Esther for the time that he was going to use her.
Okay. And we see that over and over and over in God's dealing with his people, is he has things that he expects from them, but he doesn't expect them to do it through their own strength. Okay, anybody else? Yes.
I think too, it's her personality and her character. It speaks very highly of that. Every important person that she encountered, it says that she found favor with them. And I always kind of look at this harem as the ultimate bachelor season, where she could have gone and been one of the catty girls that try to use her beauty to cause the infighting and struggle for power in that, or she could have just kind of faded into the background and not draw attention to herself. But she acted in a way that was clearly impressive to these men that were used to dealing with court politics.
Okay. Now, see, I would suspect you more of peeking at my notes than Jimmy, but you don't live with me, so I know that's not the case. Okay, so those are good points, and that's pretty much along the lines that I was going. So just to kind of circle back around those, the idea of Esther being beautiful. Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Also, the king was so pleased with her, he had a banquet and really celebrated her as queen.
Yes. And you see that right at the beginning, and thank you for reminding me of that. I meant to mention that. He threw this banquet to celebrate her, and then as he went through to the point where she comes into his presence, I doubt he would have done that for just anybody. And then not only that, but was solicitous of what was troubling her to cause her to do that. So I think you do really see a genuine concern, but that speaks to Ashley's point about Esther seemed to be the kind of person that could connect with very important men at the time and make those kind of connections. So yes, Don.
Just thinking, I have to go back to Joseph, all the things he did, how God used him. He was going to prison, and yet he was elevated.
Yes.
Everywhere he went to Potiphar's house, he was elevated. And I see her as a kind of a similar to him, that she's going to succeed whatever she does because God is working in the background.
Yeah, but I think too, and I appreciate that parallel to Joseph, because you're right. Everywhere Joseph went, he found favor. Let's see, did I write it down? Luke 2:52 describes Jesus as a young man, and it says he grew in stature and favor before God and men. And it's a similar statement as is made about Esther here. So while she was a very physically attractive young woman, her beauty went beyond that, I think. You can see, because she did find favor with the king. She found favor with the eunuch. the point about the harem, and I mean, we don't really know what harems were like, but from what I've read about, they were hotbeds of intrigue because you had all these women maneuvering, and these palaces were not generally places where people were very forthright and forthcoming. But, most palaces, especially in the days that we're talking about here, where the kings had the kind of power that there were constant schemes, and yet Esther manages to move through this and finding favor with the people that she comes into contact with. So yes, she was a very beautiful woman, but I think that beauty was inside and out. So, and as we go through these, I want to try to make applications that we can draw from Esther. 1 Peter 3:3-4, Peter talks about inner beauty being more important than outer beauty. And he's writing to women, but guys, that applies to us too. And I think Joseph was, I think, described as a handsome young man, and yet it wasn't his physical appearance that he kept finding favor. It was the person he was. And we understand as Christians, that's because as we reflect more of Christ, just like Christ was described in Luke as growing in favor before God and men, if we try to be like Christ, and Esther and some of the other, Joseph, be those kinds of people, then we hopefully can find that kind of favor as well. So when people encountered, have you ever seen an attractive woman who people are actually put off by how attractive she is? And in some cases, they're put off by her opinion of how attractive she is. I mean, we've seen that. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case with Esther. I mean, her personality, her inner beauty her value went far beyond just her appearance. Although I do think her appearance is probably what drew the king's officials' attention in the first place. Okay, I want to come back to this idea of Esther being faithful is how I put this down. Don drew the parallel to Joseph. I see a lot of parallels with Daniel in Esther as well. And specifically, as a young person, Daniel was also subjected to a period of training and indoctrination and, makeover. Although not quite in the same way as Esther, but Esther spent 12 months in this harem and being trained and having all of her makeovers done and everything and being surrounded by these women. And yet, when it came down to a choice, what choice did Esther make? She chose to risk herself on behalf of her people. So I see Esther as being faithful to her heritage, faithful to her people, faithful to her cousin, Mordecai, and faithful ultimately to God. Even though God is not specifically mentioned, and we've talked about this, I do see some places where I think you can infer that God's in the picture. What did Mordecai tell Esther? He said, if not from you, then what? Yeah, deliverance, but there was an expectation that the Jews would be delivered. To me, that's, even though it's not explicit, that speaks that there's some faith that Mordecai had that the Jews as a people were going to be delivered. And perhaps, Esther, you're the hand that God has put there, but there was going to be delivered. Esther's requesting the people fast with her. Again, that was a common practice of the Jews. So I read some commentaries that said, Esther wasn't really that religious. Mordecai really probably wasn't that religious. I don't know that that's entirely fair. The point being made is we don't have any prayers recorded like we do of Daniel or Jeremiah or Joseph. And we don't see any great acts of holiness or overt depending entirely on God like Daniel in the lion's den. And yet I don't think it's really fair to say that Esther and Mordecai were very secular, because it's at least implied if it's not explicitly stated.
I think that's what makes Esther's story that much more applicable and interesting for us, though, is because we don't have God speaking to us directly, and there's no revelation of God speaking to Esther or Mordecai directly. It's just people who are doing everyday life the best they can faithfully, and suddenly they find themselves in extraordinary circumstances, and they have to find a way to do the right thing and have the courage to do it. I think we all love stories like that because, like, wow, that could happen to me. You know, I'm just a normal guy, and I might be put into a situation where my faith is tested and my courage is tested, and I hope that I do the right thing in that moment.
That's right.
Yeah. And hold that thought, and because I've got some more to share, but I think you're exactly right, and I do think that makes Esther's story particular. Because I'll be honest with you, when I think about Moses, or I think about Daniel, or I think about Paul, and then I think about myself, there's not a whole lot of measuring up. But Esther, I can kind of get behind, you know, because Esther is, like you said, we can see a lot of ourselves in Esther. But coming back for a moment to this idea of being, you know, she was lavished with wealth. She was lavished with attention by succeeding and becoming the queen. She could have easily kind of left, said, well, that was my old life. But that's not what she did. She stayed faithful to her people. She stayed faithful to her family. You know, you may or may not have caught this in chapter 2. When Mordecai discovers the plot, he actually tells Esther about the plot. And Esther goes to the king, but she reports the plot in Mordecai's name. You know, she could have, and, you know, based on what I understand, politics in the palace, probably most would have taken credit for that herself. But she, you know, so she remained true to who she was and who her people were. And I think, again, you're doing her a disservice if you take God. I think she stayed true to the God of Israel throughout all this, living among these people, being indoctrinated in their way of thinking, you know, having to navigate this maze of palace life, and yet she remains faithful to who she was and more importantly, who her God was. You know, application for us. Worldly influences are constantly seeking to undermine our relationship with God, to convince us, well, at this stage of my life, fill in the blank. You know, but Ecclesiastes, the writer of Ecclesiastes says, remember the Creator in the days of your youth. But that doesn't mean don't remember Him in the days of your age. Hebrews 11, 14, 16 talks about the faithful saying that they are seeking for a better country, and that those who say things acknowledge that this is not their country. And what I like about that passage in verse 14, it says, therefore God is not ashamed to be their God. And, you know, that's one of those verses you can read by real easily, but you stop and think about that. God is not ashamed to claim you as one of His own. You know, when you have that faithfulness to say, I don't care about all of this stuff around me. What's important to me is this. And I think you see that in Esther's character. Let's talk about Esther's bravery. Was Esther brave? Or courageous, if you prefer the term? Yes. Was Esther afraid?
Yes.
Yes. Reasonably?
If you look at what Mordecai told her, don't think for a minute in your heart, just because that you're in the king's palace any more than you're going to escape because with these others. But I really like in verse 15 of chapter 4, the statement there at the last of that verse. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. But if I perish, I perish.
Who does that remind you of? That statement right there, does that remind you of anybody else around this same time frame? Do you remember Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah standing in front of Nebuchadnezzar in the fiery furnace? And they said, we don't have to give you an answer for this, because if our God is willing, he can deliver us from this furnace. But then they went on and said, but even if he's not, we're not going to bow down to your idol. That rang all kinds of bells when I read what Esther said, because it's that same, and that's why I think it's not fair to say Esther was probably pretty secular in her thinking, because that right there sounds a lot like I'm putting my hands in God, or I'm putting myself in God's hands. And if it's not God's will for me to be the deliverance, then I'll perish. But I'm going to do what... Now, Mordecai has to kind of help her a little bit to recognize what needed to be done. But once Esther recognized what she needed to do, she did. And that's courage. Courage is not being afraid. Courage is doing what you understand needs to be done despite being afraid. And I think it was reasonable for Esther to be afraid to enter that throne room. And I can just imagine how hard her heart was pounding when she was waiting for the doors to open. You know, because she was risking her life, but she was doing it because Mordecai had pointed out to her that this is what needs to be done. And you're the only one that can do it. And that goes back to Max's point about God puts us in positions sometimes where we're the only one that can accomplish that purpose. Now, to Mordecai's point, okay, you don't want to do it. God always has another way to accomplish. No one's ever going to defeat his purposes. But sometimes we're putting where it's up to you if this is going to get done. And I think that's where Esther found herself. It's interesting. In Matthew 10, and Mark actually read part of this tonight. Jesus uses similar language to his disciples that Mordecai uses to Esther, because Mordecai basically tells Esther, well, don't think you're getting out of this. You know, and you know, there would be at least a not unreasonable rationale. Hey, I've been passing for not Jewish for the last number of years. I could just sit here and remain silent and let all this blow by and not risk myself, but also, and Mordecai points out to her, no, you're not going to escape this. Well, if you look at what Jesus said to his disciples in Matthew 10, verse 27, that's not right. Hang on, okay, here it is. It is Matthew 10, 27. What I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light. What you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim upon the housetops. And do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. Fear should not be our only motivation in obeying God, and here specifically obeying the commandment we have to share what we've been taught. But it's not a motivation either, you know. And I think that's kind of what Mordecai was getting at with Esther was, you know, you need to do this because if you don't, it's not going to go well for you. Jesus uses similar language. Jesus also goes on in verse 32, say, everyone therefore who shall confess me before men, I will also confess him before my Father. But whoever shall deny me before men, I will also deny him before my Father. So there's kind of that, you know, that principle is still in play. God gives us opportunities to do things and gives us the choice to do them or not, but our choices have consequences. And there would have been consequences for Esther, and there'd be consequences for Jesus' disciples, and there's consequences for us when we see what needs to be done and choose not to do it. I always do this. I worry about not having enough, and then I run out of time. I want to get to this about Esther, though. We've used the word wise, smart, humble, respectful. Jimmy mentioned her wisdom being on display when she was going to... The rule for the girls in the harem was you can take anything you want, go into the king. But Esther went to the chief eunuch who was likely older, certainly more experienced in the goings-on of the palace and the king, and asked him, what should I do? And she only did what he advised, to your point, Elliot. That's wisdom. That's smart. And that's something you don't see that much among young people, especially today. But she was willing to go to people who were more knowledgeable, more experienced than she was. And not only ask for their advice, but then take their advice. Wisdom. Elliot mentioned verse 20 about Mordecai and in chapter 2, and it says that Esther did what Mordecai told her as she had done when under his care. So again, that idea of being submissive and obedient to the men who were placed in authority over her. We talked about how she approached the king. You know, she knew how to approach the king. You know, she had this banquet. She said, I'm not going to tell you right now. I'll have another banquet tomorrow, kind of build it. She knew how to get the king in the right frame of mind to make this request successful. She also, invited Haman so that he could be there when, which also is very, Haman wasn't going to jump on a fast horse and get away. So she's very deliberate. She's very careful in her consideration and how she's trying to do this thing for God, but she's not just saying, well, I guess it'll just work out. She's actually being wise in how she tries to accomplish the purpose that she understands has been given to her. Esther submitted to authority. Elliot, I said I had a question for you. Did that make her a doormat?
She kind of used authority to point her in the right direction at times. Okay, here's what I'm getting at. So often today, people treat men and women and roles as a zero-sum game. If men are more important, women have to be less important. And a lot of times they say that's what the Bible teaches. That's what people who believe the Bible, the patriarchy, right? Is there some truth to men having authority over women? If you read the Bible, there is. Does that diminish women? Do men having authority diminish the value of women? No. And Esther, I think, is a good place to come see. Esther she submitted, but she worked effectively within her role. Did she not? Let me ask you this. I've got a couple questions, and I know we're running out of time, but I want to point this out. Could Esther have delivered her people on her own authority? No, she didn't have that authority, right? I mean, Vashti, and that's a different topic, so don't take this as bashing Vashti, but she tried to stand up and say, I'm not going to do that, and what happened to her? She tried to exert her authority, and she was put out. If Esther had tried to do that, would the people have been delivered? Well, yes, because God would have found another way, but would Esther have been effective if she had tried? No, she worked within the role that she occupied. Does that diminish the deliverance she accomplished? I mean, we're reading about her, right? Thousands of years later, we know her name. We know about her family life. We know about what she did. But the fact that she didn't have the authority to stand up and be Joan of Arc and wave a flaming sword doesn't diminish what she did. Doesn't diminish her courage, doesn't diminish her wisdom, doesn't diminish her ability to connect with people, and doesn't diminish the faithfulness that she showed in carrying out, risking her life for her God and her people. After Haman was exposed, it says that the king gave Esther the house of Haman, and Esther turns around and sets Mordecai over it. Okay, but did that diminish Esther's role in Mordecai? Now, Mordecai goes on to become, I think by the end of the book, it says he's second only to the king.
But without Esther doing what she did, would Mordecai occupy that position? So does that mean Mordecai having that position diminishes Esther's role in... You see what I'm trying to get at there? I get so frustrated sometimes listening to people talk about, well, women have to be equal to men. Well, no, they don't, because look at Esther. Esther wasn't equal to the king, but look what she did. Because she operated within the roles that were set for her. And God sets different roles for men and women. But that doesn't mean that women are being diminished because they don't have the same role as men. And I think this is a very good place to go and explain that or show that to people in secular terms, if you will. Not just talking about the home and the family, but here's kingdoms and the fates of people, and yet that principle is still being applied. Esther is in no way diminished by the fact that she didn't have the authority to decree. Who wrote the edict, by the way, to save the Jews? If you read it, it was Mordecai. Does that mean that Esther's role wasn't, it was Mordecai and let me ask you this, would Esther would she have gone into the king without Mordecai? It's hard to say, but did Mordecai play a role in Esther's?
She hadn't even thought about it.
Yeah, and maybe it didn't even cross her mind.
He was the one who initiated that.
And going back to Elliot's point, she had a history of looking to him for wisdom, for guidance, for instruction. And if you want to call it command, call it command. But he pointed out the right thing to do, and she followed that. But without that urging, maybe she wouldn't have. And then maybe we wouldn't be reading this story the way we did. My point is, it's men and women together that are most effective. It was Mordecai and Esther together that performed this great deliverance. But just because the fact that Mordecai was involved doesn't diminish Esther's contribution. Okay.
Yahweh had set up the hierarchy of authority, and that's what it's all about.
Yes.
And it has nothing to do with...
And that's the thing about this book. Even though God's not ever explicitly named, you see him all throughout this story. Do you have a comment?
Well, I was going to say that it's like what was described of the body of Christ is the eye more important than the ear more important than the nose, or more important than the heart.
And
you can't live without part of it, but part of it you can, which is more important. And that's like trying to say that a man's more important than a woman, and it's not.
And that is exactly the application that I wanted to make with that is that's 1 Corinthians 12, 14 through 26, where Paul talks about just because the eye doesn't hear doesn't mean sight's not important. And it's the same idea. God created us to be I can't say the word, synergistic. We reach our ultimate when men and women work together, both in the family, but in this case, just men and women, because they're different and they bring different things. Mordecai, let me say it this way, and I know we're way past our time. Mordecai could not have delivered the people without Esther either, could he? Because he didn't have the avenue to the king. So it took Esther and Mordecai both together to achieve this. Don, you had a comment.
The king had been sleeping, and didn't like that, Mordecai would have been anyway.
Yeah, that's very true. One last just very quick thing. Jesse's point about Esther being more relatable. I know, David, you said she was extraordinary, and I think she was in appearance and personality and everything, but she's not a Daniel. She's not a Moses. She's not a Joseph. She's not a Noah. And yet, look what she accomplished, because she resolved to do what God expected her to do, to play her part. And again, like I said, I can really get behind that, because I think that speaks a lot to us. When sometimes we think maybe we don't quite measure up to a Paul or a Peter or a John or a Moses or an Abraham. Okay, Maybe we don't, but that doesn't mean that God can't use us and perform. I mean, while there are no miracles, supernatural miracles in Esther, if you read it the right way, what happened here was pretty extraordinary. You know, through a fairly ordinary young woman that was placed in extraordinary circumstances, but didn't forget who she was, who her people were, and I think more importantly, who her God was. Okay, I have more, but that's all I have time for. And I appreciate your patience in sitting here for a few extra minutes.